Welcome to How the World Works, where we talk about work and its meaning in our lives, and jobs that we've had, and jobs that we might do, and all sorts of things related to that. We have a guest I've been very much looking forward to today, an old friend of mine, David Rea, who is the pastor at Providence Presbyterian Church in Dallas. He is the second clergyman we've had on the podcast, but I think that his life and experiences will be quite different from the head of the Dominican house there in Washington. The Presbyterians and the Dominicans do things in, pardon me, rather different ways and rather different backgrounds and different work days and that sort of thing. So, David, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's a delight, Kevin.
What does your work week look like?
That's a great question. I would say Monday morning is you're in recovery mode, and you're revisiting the game film about how Sunday went and how your sermon went, and you're basically just trying to recharge the batteries. And then I would say Monday afternoon, I'm already choosing the passage for the next week. We typically go through books of the Bible, and so there's not a whole lot to have to choose from. It's basically what's in the next chapter of whatever book in the Bible I'm in, but there can be a number of different events in the next chapter. So I'll choose one, and then I will roughly outline the sermon, and then I will begin to arrange the order of service, the liturgy for the bulletin for the next week. So Monday really is a busy day.
Do you write your sermons out? Do you just make notes and go from your notes? Do you memorize them? What's your technique like there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I will look at commentaries, I will do my own analysis. I even have a Greek and Hebrew program from back in the day that I'll look at the original languages to make sure I kind of understand any of the linguistic issues that are going on. And then I just try to figure out what is the center of the meaning of the text? What did the author of the text intend to say in this? And then I will think of different ways to apply it. Like we talk about the fact that if meaning is a circle and the center of the circle is the intended meaning by the author, sometimes you have to go a little bit out from the center because maybe in the sermon last week there was a similar center. You go out from the center a little bit and something that is there, but maybe not the center of the circle. So you have to choose, am I going to go to the center of the circle, or am I going to go out a couple standard deviations and look at a different aspect of the text?
And but when you're actually doing your Sunday sermon, is it something that you've written out and memorized? Is it just notes you're going from? Are you doing it sort of semi-extemporaneously, or how does that work? Because I think anyone who's ever seen me give a speech knows that I don't have a prepared text usually. I just have some notes and then I kind of just go through it. But
I would
I,
say that I have a detailed outline. I would say a logical, linear outline that takes me through the flow of the text, but it is just an outline. And so when I get up into the pulpit, I have the logical flow in my mind, but actually when preaching it, it's, I wouldn't say extemporaneous, but it's certainly my own words.
Gotcha. And is it pretty draining for you? Some people find giving a public talk really taxing. And of course, you do it every week at least once. I imagine sometimes more. And do you really, you said you kind of recharging the batteries on Mondays. Is that, are you really kind of psychically expended, or is it just part of the job now? Or both?
I think at this part, it's part of the job. Certainly when I first started my early years, it was completely exhausting and overwhelming. But I would say these days that it's certainly intense and it is taxing, but it's not overwhelming by any stretch.
Well, were you always comfortable with public speaking, being in front of crowds and things like that? Or is that something that took you some getting used to?
I would say I was always comfortable, not because I was the valedictorian, but I was chosen to be the speaker of my high school class graduation. And I really enjoyed the experience. I thought it was a great experience, and I found that I really found it to be challenging and enriching. And that was probably my first experience with public speaking. And so I would say that I enjoy it.
I think people sometimes have unrealistic or inaccurate expectations or assumptions about what a minister's life is like and what his work is like. And I think the expectations of otherworldliness and disconnectedness are pretty pronounced in some people. Um, what is it about your job and your occupation that people most often get wrong, or what are their sort of inaccurate expectations?
Well, people, I think they're being friendly, but they can give you a hard time because they think you just work 1 hour a week.
Oh yeah.
I think that's the common misconception is that ministers work on Sunday morning and they work intensely for however long their sermon is. And then after that, they just get to relax throughout the week. And that is not the case.
So you're essentially, besides giving a weekly sermon, running a kind of large nonprofit enterprise with a number of employees and I assume, pretty good sized budget and some real estate you've got to keep up with and assets and things like that. How much of your life is administrative work of that sort?
Well, we have a spectacular staff. So I would say not as much time as you would think is on administration just because we have such a capable and competent staff, but I teach a lot in a given week. So I think right now I could have an average of almost 7 different groups I'm meeting with or studies that I'm leading throughout the week, including the Sunday sermon. But I think it could be as many as 7 different preparations that I have to do. So I would say a lot of my week, half of my week is spent on preparation, the sermon, Sunday school, different studies I lead. Uh, and then the rest of the time would be I love to do lunches. I think it's important for a minister to know his people. So I will try to set up lunches almost every day of the week and then maybe 2 or 3 coffees in the morning throughout the week. So spending time with the people. So at least half is studying exegesis, thinking through how to present a text and then just being with the people. But the staff is incredible and they carry so much of the load.
So what you're saying is you don't just work 1 hour a week, you also have coffee.
I also have coffee.
Great.
Yes, sir. I've
Who's
had
your
coffee
boss?
with you.
Yes, sometimes. Who do you work for? Like who do you answer to? How does your administrative structure work?
So that's a good question. On one level, I answer to our elders. So we have a group of elders that's also called a session in Presbyterian parlance. But I am not a member of this church. I am actually a member of the presbytery. So a presbytery is a number of Presbyterian churches in a geographic area that all come together as a governing body. So, from a technical standpoint, I am a member of the presbytery and ultimately I am accountable to them. But practically speaking, if the local session was not happy with what I was doing or had some concerns about me, they could take that to the local presbytery. But um, from an ecclesiastical standpoint, the presbytery, they are my boss, if you will.
So there's a committee somewhere then, essentially.
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
And if you were a salesman, people would judge you by your sales volume or whether you're hitting sales targets. If you're you do what I do, there are various ways of measuring output and success and such things. Someone used to do a funny skit about this preacher, but he talked like a college football coach. We're gonna win some souls this season. We'll probably lose some too, but we'll win some souls this season. But
Yes.
how do um, how do you get judged on your work? Like, how are you evaluated? Because I would think that there's got to be some tension there between you want the audience, if you will, to be satisfied, to be happy with your performance. But at the same time, if they're too happy, maybe you're not doing something right. Because I mean, part of your job as a pastor is to instruct and guide and discipline and push people in uncomfortable directions sometimes, I would imagine. So how do they decide whether you're doing a good job?
Well, uh, So they do evaluate. So the local session, the local elders would certainly evaluate uh, my ministry and how I am fulfilling my calling here. So part of it would be, do they feel like the Bible is being competently taught and communicated in a somewhat thoughtful way? And so if they feel like that the word of God is being communicated, thoughtfully and articulately in a way that's engaging, they're very, very happy. Kevin, another way of thinking about it is they're very happy if there's no crisis that has been like of my own making or of someone on my staff's making. So I think if the Bible is being competently taught and we are handling ourselves wisely and professionally, and I would also say bringing them in, there's kind of an art to knowing when to bring the session in on things the elders, because they are laymen, so they all have full-time jobs and they're very busy and they have families, and so they can't be a part of every single decision. But it takes wisdom and experience to know when to bring them in. They don't want to be surprised by something that is difficult. And so I think if you are wisely managing those things, they are very pleased, very thankful.
Gotcha. Um, what's hard about your job? I was mentioning the question of expectations earlier, and we've all had that experience when you're like 8 years old and the first time you run into one of your teachers, like in the grocery store or something, and you get that thing, oh, this is a real person, actually. She doesn't just pop up in my classroom and she's got to let go buy groceries and she probably has a family and a house and she doesn't spend all of her time thinking about how I color in the lines or not inside the lines. I imagine if you're out having a beer with a friend and you run into someone sometimes, it can be maybe jarring or there must be certain social expectations that go along with your job and your position that can be maybe pressing at times.
One of the many good things about being a Presbyterian is they wouldn't be concerned if they saw me having a beer with someone at a
Well,
local
it's
establishment.
not the consumption of alcohol. We're not talking about Baptists here, obviously.
I know.
But it's that people are surprised, I think, or just they don't think about the fact that you've got a private life, you've got a family, you've got kids, you've got adult kids, in your case, and I think they often think of pastors the way they think of entertainers, or the way you think of teacher when you're in kindergarten, as this person who's just in a box and gets pulled out for the job and then put back in the box, instead of being like a sort of whole person with a potentially even complicated life sometimes.
Well, I really do think, in terms of my approach to ministry, I really want them to think of me as a friend, not just a pastor. And we have a philosophy of ministry where we want to be very engaging among our people, with our people. So I really think the vast majority don't view me as you might some bishop like figure that you see from a distance. I am with my people a lot. Like I said, we'll have lunches together, we'll eat together in homes. And so I really do think they view me as a very normal, regular, down to earth person. Uh, I don't, so I will wear a suit on Sunday or just a blazer and a tie. And I decided many years ago when the church plant started that I didn't want to wear a robe. Not that I think robes are wrong in any way, but I can remember being a boy and seeing my minister in a robe, and I just did not feel like I could relate to him. I felt like he was almost a different species of person, and I never wanted our people to feel that way. So I don't come in with a Hawaiian shirt and sandals. Not, that's fine too. I try to wear very respectful clothing, but I want for people to understand that I am just a normal person. I am a sinner, no different than they are, and we're all beggars showing other beggars where to find food.
Yeah, well, it seems to me that's the point of the robe, isn't it? I mean, that's why judges wear black robes. It's the idea is to, sort of obliterate the individual and emphasize the office. And I think for maybe some religious context that makes sense, and for some it doesn't. So I've known you for a long time now, and listened to many sermons of yours and enjoy them very much. You're very good at what you do, but you have a bit of a funny story about the first time we met. The first time I was in one of your pews, and why don't you maybe tell that story?
So glad you brought that up. So yes, I think it was December of either 2017 or 2018.
Not long ago.
Yes, and we were doing an Advent series at church. And in the middle of my sermon, and it was a sermon on, and I'll never forget the sermon we were on. We were talking about how, what kind of, when it says there was no room in the inn for Joseph and Mary and Jesus, and what does that mean? And so I remember looking down during the sermon and I saw this uh, very imposing figure, maybe on the second row, leaning forward. He had a very big, thick, bushy black beard, and he had the most scrutinizing gaze I had ever seen. His brow was furrowed. He was looking at me with great intensity, to the degree that it was distracting to me, because I was wondering, who is this person and why does he want to kill me? And I can remember going home
It's got
and
that face. I
Stephanie,
can't help it.
yeah, so my wife said to me, well, how did you think it went? And I said, well, I think it went fine. But I said, there was a guy on the second row who looked at me like he had daggers in his eyes. And I think he really disliked the service and me in particular. And I don't think he'll ever be back. And she actually rebuked me. And she says, you have no idea what he's thinking and feeling. That may just be his resting face. And I said, well, it can't be. And then I found out that it was Kevin Williamson, who's become one of my best friends. And I can say that is his resting face.
Tragically, that's the face I've got. Um, I don't notice people in audiences that I'm talking to that much that way. I I tend to sort of look over their heads, and maybe that's I'm not good at public speaking in general, and I'm a little bit I guess shy is the word for it. I don't like that sort of attention. I mean, I do it a lot, so it's at the point in life where it's kind of like, why even bother thinking about it? But I still find out that I have these little ticks where I avoid that kind of direct interaction. I think with people when I am talking in that kind of context. So maybe if I did it every week professionally, the way you do it, I would get to be more at ease with it. Yeah, I do remember that, and then the first time we met after that, you were I wouldn't say defensive, but a little tentative, like you thought you might be murdered over the course of the
Right.
conversation. So sorry about that. I'm just sort of with the beard gone. I think I'm a little less homicidal looking.
You're like a big teddy bear now, Kevin.
Yeah, big. That's what people say. Yeah. Among other things, you are a. I'm gonna grill you on some biblical stuff here in a little bit because I do actually have a question about work that I'd like to bring up with you. But you are also a very serious tennis player, and I know you worked at tennis courts when you were a kid, when you were in school, and that stuff, uh, and you were involved in college ministry before you became a church pastor. You were at SMU, am I correct? And you were the head of the Presbyterian campus ministry there. And so I
That's right.
imagine there was some sports involved in that too. But I know tennis has been a big part of your life. It's something you still spend a lot of time doing. You're a very competitive guy in that way. Talk a little bit about tennis and how that's shaped your career and your thinking about how you conduct your work.
It's a great question. Yeah, I think the Lord has really used tennis in my life. I feel like it's saved me, lowercase s, on many occasions because it's just so cathartic. And there are so many life lessons in tennis. And it's just a place you can go and play and block everything out. And it's like you're 14 again, playing. I can remember there's this little neighborhood club we were a part of. My mom was out there playing, and I had been at the little neighborhood pool, and I went over uh, to meet her and to go home. And one of the pros, this is the story of how I started. One of the pros walked out, and they were down one little boy to play against another little neighborhood club in Charlotte, North Carolina. And he said, "Do you play tennis?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, would you like to learn? We have a match tomorrow." And I said, "Well, sure." He let me borrow a racket and went out and played. I don't think I won 1 point, but I was hooked. And I've literally played since I was 11 or 12 until now, and just absolutely love it. And I'm so thankful that it's a part of my life.
Is it the physicality that you find cathartic? Is it the somebody wins, somebody loses, there's a conclusion? What is it that you find release in tennis?
Like you said, I am competitive, and I mean, tennis is the closest thing to non-contact boxing that you could have, because if you play singles, you're not part of a team. It's mano a mano. If you're playing, you know, a female friend, but it's person against person, and there's no one who can help you, and you've got to figure it out. And so I think kind of that personal competitive aspect to it, I just found very compelling. You've got to figure it out. And that's very challenging, and it's
Yeah,
also physically demanding.
yeah. So mano a mano means hand to hand. So you're allowed to use that with ladies because they have hands as well.
That's true.
And that is true. Yeah, one of
Good point.
my favorite writers, I mentioned these before, David Foster Wallace, described tennis as chess on the run. For him, it was a very cerebral, strategic kind of game. For me, it's just can I get to the ball fast enough and get a racket on it to get it back on the other side of the net, maybe within bounds if I'm lucky. But I'm a terrible tennis player. All right, so this is a podcast that is largely about work, and we talk about our jobs, but I'm also very interested in the role that work plays in our lives and in our society, not just as a way to feed ourselves and create some sort of economic value and pay the mortgage, but it's something that most of us have to spend half or more of our waking hours doing. Some of us get a great deal of our sense of self and meaning out of it, maybe too much. Sometimes I think you would argue, and I would as well. But there's a religious component to work, I think, that is worth thinking about. Re Almost every religion in the world that I've ever come across that I've studied at all has, a particular set of attitudes about work. In the same way they have a set of attitudes about family and parenthood and reproduction and death and those sorts of things that are just natural, inevitable parts of life. And I've always thought that there's a bit of a tension in the Christian view of work, in the sense that you've got the Genesis story and the expulsion from the garden, and in that context, work is sort of a curse. The punishment for man is that he gets bread by the sweat of his brow, and no longer can be just fed from the goodness of creation, and has to go out there and labor, and it's connected to his mortality. But then in the New Testament, you get a lot of different kind of accounts of work, and the idea that the laborer's worth is higher, and work as this honorable thing. And of course, there's various examples of that. There's examples of the good worker and bad workers, and so it's taken as something that has a moral and ethical significance. So you were my pastor at times, at least you were when I was living in Dallas. Instruct me here. Tell me what I need to think about work from a Christian point of view.
Well, I think that work, like you said, is work is just an intrinsic part of God's creation. God gave man work to do in the very beginning. Labor and work was a part of God's original and good design. In Genesis 2:15, the text indicates Adam was placed in the garden to work it and to keep it. And so that's part of who we are as image bearers of God. I mean, we have communicable attributes of God, meaning we are like him in some ways. And for 6 days, God created and called it very good. And then on the seventh day, he rested. And so there's that, 6 days work, 1 day rest cycle from the very beginning. So work is good. There is inherent dignity, meaning, and value in work. But in terms of like, how are we to think about work after the fall, after Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden? I don't know if I would say work itself is the curse, in as much as the conditions surrounding work, not the principle of work itself, came under the curse. Like work became difficult and the ground grew up thorns and thistles, but work itself retained its dignity and its goodness. And like you said, in the new covenant with Christ and the Apostle Paul, we get kind of a new gospel clarity about work. And like in Colossians 3, we're called to labor unto the Lord. Um, Work, in a sense, in the new covenant is reframed as like direct service to Christ. And I would say I'm not, I don't subscribe to the sacred secular dichotomy. And so I think all legitimate vocation is blessed by God, has inherent dignity, whether you are writing books like Kevin Williamson, or you are a pastor like David, or you are Roger Federer, who's an artist on the tennis court. All of those things, as lawful vocations, have great dignity, value, and worth. There is a telos, there is a purpose in our work. It's not just something that we do, like the book of Ecclesiastes would talk about, everything is vanity. A man gets up and he works all day, he goes to bed, and then he just repeats the same thing. The holistic view of the Bible is work is glorifying to God. It has inherent dignity and value and is heightened and renewed in the new covenant for its significance. And so as we work, we're working for the glory of God in Christ, regardless of the vocation.
So why and how is work glorifying?
Because, well, he gave us work to do. He gave us work in the beginning to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and bring it under his authority. And in that way, we were reflecting his image. And so we're being like him. We are emulating him. And so in the fact that we are made by him, we're made in God's image, we're doing what he's called us to do, and we're showing that we're like him, that brings him honor and glory. And so like the creation, in the garden and whatnot was good, but it still needed to be brought under the domain of God's, we would call Adam his vice regent. So Adam was there as God's steward to bring order to this world. And that gives God great glory as we fulfill that mission and calling.
So we're given certain faculties and capabilities, and there's an honor and glorification in exercising those in the way that's in accordance with the divine will. You're saying.
Yes, like I know your children, and I know one of your children in particular, the oldest. And even though Kevin has this amazing, serious resting face, I have seen you giddy and laughing when you see your son and when you see how he learns and how the world is becoming new to him, and as he learns to read and he shows interest in you know the sanitation workers and various trucks,
He loves the
and
trash truck. Ooh.
you see his curiosity. It just brings you joy. You see him growing into who he was designed to be, and he looks just like you. um, as I understand, you also had golden locks as a child,
It's fun and time, yes.
and so you see that precious boy becoming who he's made to be, and it brings you joy. And I think that's an analogy.
Gotcha. So the presentation of God as a father in sort of Christian symbolism is, in your view, I'm not going to say well chosen. That seems too light, but significant.
It is. The Apostle Paul said we've been adopted by God as sons and daughters, and through God's Spirit, we call him Abba, which means father. There's this very much this fatherly relationship between God and his people, for sure.
But it's certainly possible to go too far with that as well. With work, I mean, not with fatherhood. I'm changing the subject here. Um, I've heard you talk from time to time about these problems of sort of subtle kinds of idolatry in our lives, where we'll make too much of our occupations or our status or our, wealth or income or other sorts of things that we have in life. Um, what does an unhealthy attitude toward work look like to you?
Within the context of I'm a part of the Presbyterian Church in America, we we will define sin in a variety of ways, but one way to understand sin is through the lens of idolatry. And so sometimes it's not the thing itself, it's when you love it too much. It's when you make a good thing into an ultimate thing. Or another way of defining it is like, I love tennis, and tennis has been an amazing hobby and lifelong sport. But if my happiness and contentment began to be altered or impacted based on my results in tennis, then that would be kind of a diagnostic tool to know that I am placing too much emphasis. I am placing too much of my value, worth, and identity in tennis. And so there can be some just inherently sinful jobs that people can do. But many of the jobs that are out there, I would hope to think most, are legitimate uh, vocational callings, but it happens when you begin to love it too much, and it becomes an idol of the heart. And in those situations, it needs to be repented of.
Man once said, "Don't tell my mother I'm a journalist. She thinks I'm a piano player in a whorehouse." Um,
That's a good one.
yeah, yeah. That to me sounds about right. Um, I wonder now because I did go to your church for some years. I'm familiar with it. Um, you have a congregation that is, I think, in general, pretty well heeled. Not exclusively so. It's not, homogenous by any stretch of the imagination, but a lot of pretty high income folks and households. It seems like, highly educated people, that sort of thing. Do you think those folks fall more easily into over investing in careers and work and the status and income and such that can come with those things? Is it more of a danger? Is it harder for a rich man to get into heaven than a camel through the eye of a needle sort of thing, or what do you think? Speaking of which,
I
what should we just think about that particular passage? That is one that you often hear people talk about in ways that seem to me some motivated reasoning going on.
I think Jesus is using metaphorical language there. Uh, some some have speculated that there was an arch of a city that was low, that was actually what they would term the eye of the needle. I don't think that. I think he's just saying that conceivably it's harder for a rich man who has so much invested in this world to be able to take up his cross and deny himself and follow the Lord, and that can be extremely difficult, if not impossible, without the grace of the Holy Spirit. If you have that kind of wealth. But I also think it's true in almost every vocation. If I can tell you a little story that kind of brought it home to me a number of years ago, right after we moved into uh, this building that we're in now, and I have this beautiful, wonderful office. I had been over to have lunch with a parishioner, and I really enjoyed this person, and they have done fabulously well. And I went over, we had lunch in his office, and he had a home office, and it had this beautiful glass. It was almost like a room of glass, but one solid wall with his bookshelves and things. And uh, we were talking about his average day, and I think he would, based on his market strategy, he basically would be done around 2 or 3 every day. Maybe he wouldn't start till like 9 a.m. and would be done about 2. And he had this beautiful glass office. Inside, I was eaten up with envy because I think it was a very difficult season in the life of the church when we moved here. And I just thought, oh man, if I could have a job like that, that would be a life worth living. This is absolutely true. I'd say about 6 months later, he had an issue and a concern, and he said, "Can I come to your office to meet?" And I said, "Sure." And so he came up to my office, and he was sitting in a chair, and we were talking about what was going on. And I could tell he wasn't really paying attention to me. And I said, "What is going on?" And by the way, I had never told him what I was thinking that day in his office. That was just my inward struggle. And he said, I said, "Why are you distracted?" He said, he was sitting in the chair that looked at all my books. He said, "I would give anything to have your job." He said, "I would just love to sit here and read those books." And it was just a good, vivid reminder that we can all be grass is greener. We can covet and desire what another person has. We're all looking for meaning and value in places other than the Lord. And whether you're a cobbler, a street cleaner, a tennis pro, a famous writer, a pastor, we're just hardwired due to sin to try to find our identity in and of ourselves. So I think it's a challenge in every single church, in every single vocation, regardless of how much money there is or isn't.
Yeah.
We're very creative when we find ways and things to take pride in.
Yes. And don't really necessarily have to be all that creative. Sometimes it's just, there's something right in front of you. And everyone knows what he's good at or what he has, right?
Right.
And it doesn't have to, you don't need someone else to explain it to you all that often. Um, yeah, I think people know when they're going to pick the thing to make an idol out of, they don't need to think about it too much. It kind of comes, I think, kind of comes naturally to people. You're talking about this guy with his office and him wanting to have your job. You've surely thought from time to time that if you weren't doing what you're doing, what would you be doing in life? What are other jobs that you might have appealed to you that you might have gone a different way? I mean, assuming if being a professional tennis player had been in the realm of possibility, that would be a good one for you. But there must be some
Yes,
other things as well.
sadly, that was not within the realm of possibility. I think being a professor, some kind of teacher, I've always loved to teach. I think that's what drew me to tennis early on. In terms of like my summer jobs, is I really enjoyed, I got great satisfaction out of teaching people how to play, and it brought me great joy and delight to see them do well. So I think in another life, I would have loved to have been a professor, some kind of something like that.
Were all of your summer jobs as a kid growing up tennis oriented?
My very first job was I was a lawnmower, a lawn boy. So I mowed this woman's. It was a older elderly woman down the street. I mowed her yard.
What are the kind of jobs that you have?
After that, so then my next job after that was I found a great deal on a tennis stringer. Kevin, I don't know if you've ever seen a tennis stringer, how the sausage is made, if you will, how a tennis racket gets strung.
I had no idea there was such a thing as a tennis stringer.
Oh yes, and people like Roger Federer and all those, they take their stringer with them
Hmm.
because it's such a specific thing. So you have your tennis racket, and the better you get in tennis, the more you break strings. And so that's why these great players will have, they're also switching every few games. But even back in the day, they would have a number of rackets because they could break two or three rackets in a single match. And
Not
especially when
just
you're
John
playing
McEnroe.
tournaments. Oh, yes, he broke rackets and strings. So at any rate, we didn't have all the money in the world growing up, and I couldn't really afford to keep putting strings in my racket. So I found a great deal on a tennis stringer. And then I found a man I knew who had a little business. And so I became his stringer, one of his stringers. And I would go 3 times a week and I would get like 10 rackets and I would take it back to my house and I would string the rackets and I would bring them back the next day. I probably did that for 4 or 5 years, but that was my first job after mowing lawns in the tennis world,
So you
and
were a
really first
self-employed
job,
entrepreneur.
self-employed entrepreneur.
Oh, that's I didn't know that about you. Um, I find that I have the entrepreneurial itch and not much entrepreneurial talent. The couple of times when I've tried to start something, it's typically not gone all that well. Although the hope springs eternal and all that. After your tennis stringing business, what else did you do?
So I taught at local clubs. So Charlotte was and is a place where it has so many wonderful racket and swim clubs in all kinds of different neighborhoods. So there are country clubs in Charlotte, but you have a plethora of local racket and swim clubs where you would have a swimming pool and then you would have 4 to 6 hard courts. It was not expensive for the local club to keep up. And then during the summers, they would hire a college player, somebody like that, to be a tennis pro. And so I did that all through college and even a couple years in seminary.
Speaking of which, tell me about your education. How does one prepare to do your kind of ministry?
Well, I grew up in Charlotte, and then I ultimately went to a seminary that is actually one of the main campuses is located in Charlotte. It's called Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so I attended, we call it RTS. I attended RTS Charlotte and got my Master's of Divinity at RTS Charlotte. And
Undergraduate
from
before that?
undergraduate, went to Appalachian State, App State, and the mountains, the beautiful mountains of North Carolina.
Majored in what?
Business, got a BA in business, and was on my way to probably try to do some kind of business or something. And then my life took a turn in college where I, discovered or really believed really and truly in Christ and the gospel, and it really changed the trajectory of my life.
So when people hear about, the vocation to ministry, I think the general, kind of imagination is sort of a voice whispering in your ear at night somewhere. How does that go for you when you start thinking, well, I have a business degree, and but I think what I really want to do is be a church pastor. Like, what's the process like of getting into that as a practical matter? And did you have to convince yourself to do it, or when the idea got into your head, did you just think, oh yeah, that sounds great. I think I'd like to do that.
That's another great question. So I think I have a little bit of a minority view on this, Kevin, certainly in my context. So when someone comes before presbytery in our context, he will have to explain to the group when he's taking his ordination exams, he'll have to explain his quote, it's called a quote, call to the ministry, end quote. And you have to explain your call to the ministry. And typically, as it goes, there are two parts of a call. There is what we describe as an internal call, this feeling that you have that God is calling you to ministry, and then there's an external call. Maybe it would be people like you or friends or somebody in the local church who recognizes what they perceive to be giftedness, and so you put together this internal call, the sense of God's call in your life, and then this external call. You have gifts and competency, to teach God's word, and then that translates into a call, maybe capital C. I do over the years. I am less enamored with that term. I think the Bible would view more calling in the sense of like a salvific calling where the Holy Spirit calls you to himself. But I don't believe that even if God, did place this call, this unique call to Christian ministry somewhat differently than he called Fred to be a stockbroker or something like that, how would one know? How would one be able to discern the difference between, uh, is it a really strong feeling? Is it a hunch? Did I feel a quote unquote prompting? Did I drive by, and see a big billboard that said ministry on it? Or was I thinking and praying about this and I saw like a Christian fish on a bumper sticker in front of me? Like, are we like doing a spiritual CSI investigation to try to figure out if we're called? And I would say no. I would say, I think that God works on our desires. And I think one should try to discern. So in other words, I tell, interns, like, in terms of discerning whether or not I try to talk about discerning whether or not ministry is wise for you to do. I don't like to talk in these subjective terms about this internal feeling. I try to help them think through all of us, regardless of the field or the work that we desire to go into. We should exercise biblical wisdom. And part of biblical wisdom is you try to like you would in any job. Like Kevin, if you and I got out wild hair and we decided we wanted to play in the NBA right now, we would think about it for about 4 seconds, and we would realize that we do not have the speed, the height, the capacity to play in the NBA. And if we deceived ourselves for whatever reason, our wives would be there to tell us, you need to go get some therapy. All this to say, I felt a desire to do in the lives of other people what some wonderful, godly Christian men had done in my life. Like, so when I was in college and I was thinking through the meaning and purpose of life and why are we here and what's all this about, I had some amazing men who took time out of their busy schedule to meet with me and talk with me and pray with me, and they didn't put pressure on me, and they were very wise, and it made all the difference. And so I thought, if I can do that in someone else's life, if I can teach the Bible and help them think through these things, that would be a life worth living. And so I felt like it would make sense for full-time ministry to be something for me to pursue.
Yeah.
So that's how I think about calling and trying to pull it out of this mysterious, subjective context.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking about it in roughly the same way, in that while there are some special responsibilities that go along with being in the pulpit and being in that kind of a leadership position, it is just an occupation like other occupations, and some people have aptitudes for it and some don't. Some people are good at being mechanics, some aren't. I wasn't going to use the NBA. I was going to tell you that I'm actually going to be joining the Bolshoi Ballet next month, but yeah, you're laughing, but wait till it happens, and no, it's probably not going to happen. And yeah, it's an interesting position for me, I think, just from the outside, in that maybe that's why I've had two ministers on now, in that it's more than a job and it's also a job, right? It's a thing that you have to do that requires certain skills and work and labor, and whether you've got talents for it and whether you don't, then it also is something that means more than that. But then at the same time, I think, as you were alluding to earlier, you could say the same thing about every job, right? Because we all have a particular kind of duty in life. We all have a particular kind of telos, as you would put it. And for some of us, the work that we're called to is playing basketball or driving trucks or working on diesel engines or whatever it is. Those of us who have no marketable skills become journalists and podcasters, and some people are called to certain kinds of jobs that have a certain, religious or social or political valence to them, that make the secondary, well, not secondary is not the right word, that make the broader aspect of the importance of that job more visible to people. I think I would argue that there's a kind of there's a spiritual aspect to working in any sort of job, whether you're a janitor or mechanic or anything else. There's a broader social aspect to the way those things contribute to the happiness of society and the ways that we take care of one another in just in purely material terms. But it's just more obvious and visible to people if you're a politician or a preacher or someone whose work has a kind of public aspect to it. On that subject, I would imagine one of the things that's difficult about your life right now is politics. So you are a member of a very conservative, both theologically and politically, religious community. Um, I know from experience that from time to time there are people who just want to talk about that stuff. Politics, especially in the church context, which can be uncomfortable for people and often I think probably unnecessary. How are you navigating that?
Well, it can be hard at times. There were, just to go back a little bit, I'm sure this is no surprise to you or anybody who would watch or listen to this, that the COVID years were extremely difficult. And you were
Oh, yeah.
here and you lived through that with us. And there were, as the crisis, the COVID crisis kind of developed, you had people on both sides, people on one spectrum and then on the totally other side. And whether you had masks or didn't have masks, people perceived that to be political. Every decision you made, they perceived to be political. But our particular philosophy of ministry, at least at Providence, would be we focus, Kevin, on the Great Commission. And the Great Commission is, you could call it evangelism and discipleship, like Christ called the church to make disciples by teaching and baptizing in Matthew 28. And so we try to keep our eye on the ball. And we don't think, so this gets into worldview issues as it relates to this. And there has been an element. This you can cut me off if you think I'm being too long-winded on this, but I do
No,
think
please.
it's important. I come out of a tradition that loves Abraham Kuyper. And Abraham Kuyper was obviously he was the prime minister of the Netherlands. He was a great thinker. He was a theologian. He kind of helped coin the term sphere sovereignty, which we could get into another time. But he was he was very instrumental in helping the church. And at that time, I think he was pushing against the left-leaning church, and for a variety of reasons. But his idea of sphere sovereignty is, Christ is the Lord of creation, and he's the Lord over every single sphere. And so it's not just like ministers or pastors that religion is just this private thing. God is interested in every sphere of our life, and God's sovereignty and authority extends to every sphere. But in my context, at times we have what's called neo-Kuyperians, a new kind of Kuyperianism that is marked by what we might call transformationalism, where, this is a mouthful, I think people, Kuyper has that very famous phrase, not one square inch, like there's not one square inch, or Jesus Christ doesn't say mine. He says mine on every square inch. I think Kuyper gave that speech in the late 1800s. Well, now I think what people have done is they've misunderstood every square inch of God's sovereignty over everything to thinking, oh, there's a Christian view on everything. Like there's a thus saith the Lord on everything. And that's not what Kuyper meant. And therefore, some of these neo-Kuyperians or transformationalists, they think, I'll give you an example, they think that it's the church's job to either say, like in this case, that having a border wall was sinful, and that therefore it was a matter of conscience for the church to speak out and say, we should not have a border wall. There are others that feel like it's a matter of conscience that say we should have a border wall, and it should be this high because we can't be a nation if we don't have borders. Or, what does the Bible say about minimum wage laws? And some would say, now maybe personally, I'm not sure the wisdom of minimum wage laws. I think it could be counterproductive, but that would be me as a Christian citizen. There is not a Christian view in my understanding of a minimum wage law or what it should be, or whether the Bible requires a border wall or not. That goes beyond the scope of what the Word of God says. And you can have two legitimate Christ-loving believers who come down on different sides as to whether one might think, I don't like minimum wage laws. I think it actually hurts the market. Or another person who says, I think it hurts the market to not have it. There can be charitable disagreement. There is not a Christian view of minimum wage laws or the height of a border wall. All that to say, my job is to speak where the Bible speaks and to be quiet where the Bible is quiet. And if there is something that I'm teaching that by good and necessary consequence, like, for example, in terms of when it comes to the right to life issues, I think the Bible is very clear on that issue and protecting life and guarding life, especially the unborn. But there are so many things, Kevin, where you get out like 5 standard deviations from the text. And I think ministers should focus on preaching Christ and him crucified, and ministering the means of grace, preaching the gospel, administering the sacraments, and leaving the rest to the Lord and the conscience. And so therefore we stay out of politics altogether.
You must get pressure sometimes on, say, trans issues or, marriage and sexuality issues, things like that, that are seen as matters of, I suppose, public morality, that people are going to want you to weigh in on more strongly, or not want you to, I suppose, in some cases, depending on where things are coming down on that. What do you say when someone says, "Hey, I really think that you need to speak to this, that, or the other thing"? I
I'd
tell them write me
say,
a letter to the editor, but you can't do that.
I'll tell another Kevin story. Now, after you left, you realize that there's a phrase about you that has lingered that we all implement. Do you
Yeah, I know
remember
what
this?
this is. Yeah.
We call this channeling Kevin Williamson. And I'll just tell the audience, one time, uh, someone came up, Kevin and I were talking, and a person came up and invited Kevin to a particular activity. And Kevin looked, he didn't change his expression. He was very kind, but he looked the person in the eye and he said, I will not be doing that.
Yeah,
And
political.
we
And
sat
I
there in
get enough
silence.
politics.
It was, but we sat there in silence and the person was kind of curious and they were waiting for you to say something else. And you smiled and you didn't say anything else. And so I'm working on channeling my Kevin Williamson to just say, we will not be doing that. Like, if it comes up in the text, if I'm preaching through Ephesians 5 or Genesis 1 or Matthew 19 or something, and we're talking about marriage, there obviously there could be cultural things that one would bring into the sermon, but it would be in the natural progression of going through a book of the Bible. So where it's not like my pet peeve, this would be something that we are, in other words, I'm doing the math of the text and I'm showing that it applies to this. I'm not a big fan of the topical preaching where you kind of do the issue du jour. I think God by his Spirit will bring up the things in the text as they need to be addressed.
Yeah. Yeah, I imagine you get sometimes what I get, which is where someone is going to complain to me, not that there was something wrong in the column that I wrote, but it just wasn't the one they wanted me to. Why didn't you write about this instead of that? And that happens from time to time. Although, in terms of people's expectations about these things, I'm guilty of this myself. I've told the story before, but some people in the listenership may not have heard it. That the Sunday before the presidential election, I went to Georgia and I went to Marjorie Taylor Greene's church there. It's this big, kind of very conservative mega church, and kind of expecting them to, talk about the election or kind of some political stuff where the country is. And of course, this is just me and my kind of small-minded, ignorant expectations about things. They wanted nothing to do with any of that stuff, of course, and they had not a word to say about any of it. But they kind of pranked everyone where the pastor came in and he started doing his introductory remarks, and he said, we've got a big decision to make this week, and everyone has to really follow his own conscience. That we finished remodeling the other sanctuary, and we have to decide whether we're going to go to here on Sunday or there on Sunday. Oh no, you thought I was talking about something else. Well, no, and that was all they had to say about that. So yeah, I think that there's something about the nature of being in a pulpit that makes people want to use you as an instrument. And I've got this thing that I care about a lot, and you need to care about it too because you're in a position of influence, and that is that. Well, we've already run up onto an hour here, so I should probably be wrapping things up. But any closing thoughts about the nature of work and its significance in our lives, or things that people ought to be thinking about or meditating on related to the subject?
I think the last thing I'll say is when you talked earlier about there are some vocations, some callings, some jobs where people feel like they hold, extra significance, or at least outwardly it looks like it has, there are greater implications of that job. But you also mentioned that sometimes people feel like there's, something more to a job. And I really think that God would use people's labors in their respective jobs even more if they all operated on the basis that there is something more to every job, from, you know, the maintenance worker or somebody who is counting widgets in whatever context they find themselves, that there's dignity and value, that it is a spiritual occupation, and that to do it under the glory of God, to do it the very best they can, to be genuinely and sincerely interested and focused in what they were doing, however small they perceived it, it would make a massive difference. Because I do think, as it relates to work, there is something more to every job.
Concur. I agree. David, thank you so much for your time, and good luck with everything, and we will talk again soon.
Thanks, Kevin.